Hey guys, how you doing? This is Mike McCormick with Advanced Criminology here in Owings Mills, Maryland. And today is December 21st, 2017. We'll get ready to head into a new year's, January 2018, in the next few weeks. And today's discussion, the title of this discussion is going to be Why Marilyn Mosby's Office Lost the Freddie Gray Case. I think what has bewildered a lot of citizens, a lot of local folks around the country as well, is, how could you bring indictments against 6 officers, research this case with all your legal team, spend thousands of dollars to bring this case to court, with the information that you had, with the evidence that you had, bring the charges that you had, and subsequently we find ourselves with an acquittal for all of the officers that were charged. In fact, some would say, even when I was on the police department, when you got moved around to these specialized units and they took you out of patrol, some would say that was a promotion. Some would say it was a cushy job, so to speak, where you weren't in the public's eye all day long, having to deal with calls for service. And in fact, I think the officers made out, if you ask me. Let's take a look briefly at what the officers' assignments now are. Give me a sec. Okay, we'll start off with the let's see, Sergeant White. Sergeant Lisa White now she's working with policies and training. That's what she's doing now. Lieutenant Rice is working in the crime lab collecting evidence. Officer Goodson, remember him, he was a van driver. Officer Goodson now, he's monitoring city surveillance cameras. So the blue light cameras that you see around the city, or some of the other CCTV cameras you see in the projects and all, that's what he does now. So he monitors those from a distance. Officer Porter, one of the officers who I really didn't think had anything to do with this particular case, that's just my personal viewpoint. He's doing drug trafficking now, detective in drug trafficking. Let's see, who else? Officer Garrett Miller is working in the Marine unit, so he gets to ride around in the harbor, on nice sunny days on a boat, police boat. Let's see, then you have Officer Edward Nero, who's now assigned to the aviation unit. Let's see, who else? And I think that's it. I covered them. Nero, Miller, White, Rice, Goodson, Porter. Yeah, so I covered them all. And so that's what happened with the 6 officers. They basically got transferred to what they like to call diminished areas of responsibility, where they're not patrolling the streets. As you well know, their faces were very visible, not only nationally and locally, but also internationally too. So the idea when you remove officers from the street because of their high visibility is basically to keep them out of the public's eyesight. So that's why that was done. Okay, that aside, I wanted to discuss with you, because I know it really isn't probably clear to a lot of people as to why the charges were dropped. Basically, in America, if you get locked up and you get a charge, criminal charge, and you have to go to court, the state's going to have to prove what they call every element of a charge. So if they say you did this and you used this to do that, and you put somebody in fear for their life because you did this and you used that, and we can prove every element of that particular charge, you could get found guilty either by a judge or by a jury. And that holds true for the officers who were on trial. That in fact, if the state didn't meet its burden of proving every single element of every single charge, then the court would have to find not guilty. So that's what happened, essentially. The state didn't meet its burden. They couldn't prove every element of every single charge levied against 6 officers, and as a result, the officers walked. Don't get me wrong. Nationally, and I'm talking about civilians, not officers, a lot of folks walk from charges because the state cannot meet the burden and prove all the elements of a case. But a case that was high profile like this, one would think that the prosecution's team would have certainly tried to put together a case that was more prosecutable, if you will. But there were barriers. And that's kind of the things that a lot of folks don't know, that there were barriers to the prosecution's case. So let's look at some of the barriers that were involved in this particular case. And when you hear some of the stuff that went on, you'll say, oh, I can see why certain things happened and didn't happen. So let's get back to the case here. Let's see. One of the main things that Marilyn Mosby's office talked about was that in the early stages of this case, there came a time when they asked the police department to file search warrants. Now, when they say ask the police department, they asked the homicide department, since they were investigating the case. Again, the homicide department is basically investigating their own people. So they asked the homicide department to execute warrants for the officer's cell phone. The reason that they did that is so if there's some ongoing conversations before the fact or after the fact of the murder, those conversations can be brought in as what they call out-of-court statements. And so because the request from the state's attorney's office did not get executed in time, the warrant expired. If you didn't know, all warrants have an expiration date that they have to be served by law. In this case here, I think they had 30 days to serve the warrants for the cell phones, and the police department let the warrants run out. I'll let you speculate on why that probably happened. So that was one impediment to prosecution, because that was going to come in at a later date to help out. The state's attorney believes that there was a knife, but not the knife that they say they found on Freddie Gray. They say that the knife that was used in evidence had a BPD insignia on it, meaning that it belonged to the police department. And they say that because a few people that went down to where the knife was located, next where the van was at that they were going to look at, involved in the case. And they say the police department's officers were passing the knife around, and it had a BPD insignia on it. And so their theory was that Mr. Gray was arrested before the knife was found. Now, because that was their theory, the officers' attorneys got smart real quick, and they filed motions to keep that evidence out of court, whether that knife was legal or illegal. Okay? And the motion by Judge Barry Williams handled this case, was granted for the defense not to bring the knife into evidence. So that's a second impediment to the case. Let's see. There came a time where they had to do independent investigation, where the state's attorney's office had to go out to the crime scene and start asking a lot of questions and canvass the area and talk to witnesses and things of that nature. And when they went out, they said that they basically couldn't get a lot of information from the residents in that particular area. And so basically they didn't find anything. They said they reviewed the CCTV cameras in the area. One of them was at the business. I'm familiar with that. I was all up in that area that first 2-3 weeks. So I'm familiar with the stores they were talking about where the chase began on North Avenue. And there was a store there on the corner, King's Grocery Store to be exact. And I went there and talked to the gentleman. And when I talked to him, he told me he had already submitted his videos to the police department. So they didn't do anything more than what I did, if that's the case. They also had a meeting with the lead detective. Her name was Danielle Taylor. And Detective Taylor was supposed to bring them her investigation, which encompassed somewhere between 441 pages of work, because it had to be scanned. And the day that they met, Detective Taylor said she forgot to bring them over, essentially. So as you can see, the things were kind of mounting against the prosecution's team, with the police department slow rolling their efforts to provide the things in a timely fashion to the defense. At least that's the case that the prosecution laying out. And quite naturally, both of the lead prosecutors, his name was Janice Bledsoe and the other was Michael Schatzow, they adamantly came out and said that they felt like Detective Taylor was sabotaging their case. And so, they said that they were doing things, she was doing things that was inconsistent. Now, remember, Detective Taylor has also filed many cases and tried many cases, had many cases tried in that same courthouse with other state's attorneys where it probably wasn't an issue. She probably did get that information over pretty quick. But it's in their estimation that she just didn't seem enthusiastic in terms of getting that information over to them so they could properly prepare for the case. And so that became an issue. Another issue was a seatbelt. And during the trial, there were several general orders. I always talk about general orders on this channel with the police department. And I will always talk about general orders because that's what guides the police department's conduct. So a general order that came out about seatbelts. If you recall, the deal was whether or not Freddie Gray was strapped in the van, the seatbelt. As it turned out, there were no seatbelts. Well, seatbelt was in the vans, but they weren't being used. Okay, and it came out to be, it was a policy, but the practice was just not to seatbelt anybody. One of the defense's issues was, okay, the general order came out pretty much a few days before Freddie Gray had died. Not everybody had received the general order. These general orders are electronically transferred now as PDFs. Most everything is these days. And then there's electronic signature. So if an officer gets a general order, they're supposed to comply by doing an electronic signature. That way, they know they've received it. Now, just because you receive a general order does not mean you read it. It just means that you received it. Okay. Now, this was a focal point in the case because the theory by the defense was that Freddie Gray had died, number one, because he was never strapped into his seatbelt, and number two, because of a rough ride. Those were the two theories combined together. And the charges were around those two pieces of theory presented by the state. And that time frame would be from the time of arrest to when Freddie Gray was found unresponsive in the back of the van. Okay, and so the theory was all the officers were culpable at some level and at some point from the arrest time to the unresponsive time. And that would mean why she would charge all six of them in this case. Even the medical examiner's report in some ways substantiated, it certainly substantiated that he wasn't belted in. But there was always confusion in terms of whether or not it was the rough ride, allegedly the rough ride, because that had never been proven either, was it a rough ride or not, and him not being seatbelted in, bouncing around in the back of the van. Okay, so that was always an issue. The judge, as they said, the judge found with regard to every single count that presented in the trial that there was sufficient evidence for a rational juror to find proof beyond a reasonable doubt. However, the same judge sitting as a jury didn't find that the evidence was sufficient for him to convict, and that was his right to do that. In the state of Maryland, like many states, in the Constitution of each state has a Constitution. It talks about a person who's arrested having the right for a trial before a judge or before a jury. And I find it interesting that at the end of the case, when Mosby's team lost the case, Marilyn Mosby made a statement about whether or not a judge, whether they still have judges just trying cases or people being allowed to have a judge rather than a jury. And so I kind of lost real respect for her in that regard, because I mean, the right to have a judge or a jury goes back, centuries. Who are you to try to change common law? So and she came under fire because of that by a lot of legal scholars. Just type in, what she said, and you'll find a lot of legal scholars came down on her because of that. That everybody has the right to have a judge or have a jury trial, whichever one you choose. In most cases, no matter what state you go to. But the bottom line is this. If, as I said in the beginning of this video, if you cannot meet the burden of proving each and every element of the charges that you bring those charges, you're saying that this person did this, and you can't prove every element, the case is going to get thrown out. You're going to get a not guilty verdict, and that's what they got. Let's see. What else? Okay, so that pretty much sums it up as far as why the officers in Freddie Gray's case did not get convicted. But one of the things I want to talk about too was that there seems to be a problem here in this city with these criminal justice agencies. Number one, there's a problem, as we all know, in the police department. Number two, there seems to be a problem with the prosecutorial aspect in the state's attorney's office. And number three, there seems to be an issue with the federal government. All three of these agencies seem to be in some type of conflict here, and I'm gonna tell you why. Those of you from Baltimore, if you didn't, those of you not from Baltimore, and people who are from Baltimore, can probably remember Mackenzie Elliott, who was killed about 4 years ago, over off of Old York Road in Baltimore. She was struck, she was a 3-year-old girl, struck by a drive-by shooting, and she died. And at that particular time, the police commissioner at that particular time was Anthony Bass, and he said that he would bring Mackenzie's killer to justice in a week. Well, 3.5 years passed by after that week, and there was no arrest made in that particular case. It wasn't until the federal government, Rod Rosenstein and company, stepped up, did their homework, and found that it was a gang-related shooting, and subsequently they locked up several people on the case. Okay, so that's one in their feather for the federal government coming in to step in that case, since Baltimore City could not solve it. The second case, where the Fed stepped in again, was the recent gun trace squad case, where they didn't even tell Marilyn Mosby until the indictments from the Feds came down that they had 8 officers that were going to be charged with RICO, a racketeering and corruption charge. They didn't even tell her. And quite naturally, they didn't tell the police department. They couldn't do that. So when I look at those things, and then I look at the actions of the investigating detective on the Freddie Gray case, it's a strange animal where we can't get these agencies to work together for the greater good and for the rule of law. And that's really all that matters at the end of the day, for the greater good and the rule of law, that we all need to work together for the citizens of Baltimore and the taxpayers. So I just thought I'd bring that up. And when you go back and you kind of start seeing things, how they're playing out, you don't seem to see where there's kind of cooperation amongst the agencies here for some strange reason. I mean, even the governor, Governor Hogan, and Mayor Catherine Pugh, basically are going around and around now about who has the better violence plan in the city. Who can come up with the best idea to solve the homicide problem in the city. And so, those two can't even get together on the same issue. We all have the same goal, reduce violent crime. That's the goal. And there are problems there. So it just doesn't make, at the end of the day, it just doesn't make, good sense. So I wanted to talk about those things. So if you had any questions, why it's kind of quiet in the city all of a sudden, not a lot of clamor behind. You don't even really hear people talking about the Freddie Gray case anymore unless, you hear it back in the media or something comes up related to it. I just wanted to give folks out there the background, the backdrop as to why the officers were acquitted in this particular case. Now, one other thing I want to add, all of you out there locally who can be available between 12 and 1 p.m. on Thursday the 28th of December, I'll be on the radio show at 1010 WOLB from 12 to 1, and we'll be discussing the Sean Suiter murder case. And I'd like for you guys to tune in for that. If you have any questions about it, again, just go ahead and make comments, and I'll shoot you a quick comment regarding the times again. Yeah, and if you can get a chance to call into the radio show, do that as well. So I don't have anything more. I just wanted to bring those things up, and I look forward to hearing from you. And as always, give me your comments and subscribe to the channel. Thank you.